Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Basketball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host, Nelson, and we are here today on this Tuesday afternoon. And we're going to talk a little bit about NCAA basketball, but for the first time, we're going to lead with the women's segment. And I say first time because most of the time, at least previously before, we wouldn't traditionally lead with a women's basketball game. Like, if you were to ask anyone, I'd say maybe 5 or 10 years ago, that the most important news segment in basketball was a women's basketball game, they'd call you crazy. But it's a new era, it's a new time. So in the first segment, we're going to be talking about the Elite Eight matchups from last night because it was probably the most popular day for women's basketball, at least for the tournament this year. And we're definitely going to be talking about that, particularly the Iowa Hawkeyes and the UConn Huskies making it out. And then in the second segment, we're going to shift over to NBA basketball, where we talk about Devin Booker and the Phoenix Suns, and as well as giving their possibilities of what's their high point and what's their low point, looking into the end of the season. And then we're going to do a quick recap of all the NBA games in our third segment as usual. We also have a fourth segment that I revealed towards the end of the third segment, so stay tuned and figure out exactly what that is. But before I begin, I'd like to remind everybody to please use the link in the description to get your comments recognized, or use the link displayed below the ticker on every single show segment. That is GSMCPodcast.net. Really helps the show, makes the show much more interactive between myself and you guys. Once again, the link is GSMCPodcast.net. And with that out of the way, we can go right ahead and talk about the Elite Eight last night for the women's side, particularly the Iowa Hawkeyes beating LSU in a rematch against, it's a finals rematch. They played against each other in the NCAA Women's Finals last year, and they rematched again in the Elite Eight. So this matchup was very, very anticipated and across the media, not just across the media, but also across the sports side and women's basketball and basketball as a whole. So Caitlin Clark ended the game with 41 points, 12 assists, and 7 rebounds to lead the Hawkeyes to a 94-87 win over LSU. So she recently broke records in this game. So she is this was her second career game where she scored 40 points and had 10 assists in an NCAA tournament game. Every other player, the men's and the women's side, have 0, so she stands alone in that category. This is her third 40-point NCAA tournament game. It's the most all time. She also hit 9 three-pointers in this game, tying a women's tournament record and her own career high. This is the most but she ends so far right now. She has the most career three-pointers in women's Division I history at 540, and she also has the most career assists and three-pointers in women's NCAA tournament history. So it's a long list of accolades that she ended up breaking. It's 5 completely new accolades that she has for herself and under her belt. She's without a doubt the best women's college player that I've seen, and probably the best college player, period. Excuse me, I get hiccups. And even with all the eyes on her, it seems like the pressure doesn't really get to her. Like, she's just been the greatest player that we've seen. Ayala from Albany, she says that she's the head coach, but Lisa Boulder knew that for her team to be successful against LSU, she had to get Clark moving downhill, not only to get her to the foul line, but also to break down opposing teams' defense. Mission accomplished. So their strategy for guarding Caitlin Clark is to get her to the line. And that's not really a good strategy, because if you're a good offensive player, then chances are you're always going to make it to the line. And with her being a great free throw shooter as well, that's just 2 points on the board. And that's not really something that you'd want to go into your possession, like always expecting the player to get fouled and always expecting the player to make free throws, because that's just not going to cut down any kind of deficit if you are trailing. The other game that happened yesterday was UConn going up against the number 1 seeded USC, and UConn ended up upsetting USC. Paige Buchers ended the game with 28 points, 10 rebounds, and led UConn to an 80-73 win over the number 1 seed USC. And this was Juju Watkins' first ever Elite Eight appearance, and she's probably going to end up making a lot more, considering how a lot of people consider her to be just as good, if not better, than Caitlin Clark, because as a freshman, Juju has scored more points compared to what Caitlin scored as a freshman. So right now, she's sort of on pace to being able to break all of Caitlin's accolades, assuming she plays as long and she doesn't get injured. But we'll see how that goes. The Huskies are into their 23rd Final Four appearance. This is the most ever, and they're 15th in the last 16 tournaments. And the fact that they did it this year in particular with so many injuries in their lineup, 5 players were out for the year. It really shows just how much better Buchers and Gino Arima, excuse me if I botched that last name. It just shows how much better they are than the rest of the competition and how they measure up in terms of compared to the rest of the female basketball players. And a lot more history was made, with this Final Four appearance. So South Carolina, obviously, not yesterday, but on Sunday, they ended up playing Oregon State, and they continue being flawless. They hold a 36-0 record in the regular season, and they continue that flawless record, winning 70-58 on Sunday. And North Carolina State ended up upsetting Texas as well, ended up winning 76-66. So North Carolina and South Carolina are expected to match up against each other in the Final Four. And this is the first time in the history of college basketball that 2 programs have had both the women's team and the men's team make it to the Final Four in the same year. And the both of those teams that did that were North Carolina State and UConn. So their programs and their basketball programs, they're just so much better than the rest of the competition. I mean, having both the women's and the men's program in the Final Four is unheard of. Like, most of the time, you hear it happen on one side, then you hear it happen on the other, and it's like some colleges, they have a good women's basketball program, but they don't have a good men's basketball program, and vice versa. Now, this is the first time in history that both programs make it all the way, and it definitely is a statement for UConn and their. What would be really crazy is if both teams end up matching up against each other in the straight finals, but I don't think that's going to happen on the women's side. I think that Iowa is going to put a quick stop to that and end up beating. Let's see who they play. End up beating UConn in the next matchup in the Final Four. They play on Friday, April 5th at 9:30. So stay tuned for that game. But I'm pretty sure that Caitlin Clark is going to be enough to stop UConn. But we'll see, because it's a lot of the women's side. It's for college. It's definitely more like there's more focus on star power than there is focus on individual, on a team-based game style, I guess you could say. So, on the men's side, you might see a lot more ball movement, and as a result, you might not get that player that scores 30 or 40 points. But on the women's side, you see a lot more isolation, especially when you have talents like Caitlin Clark, Juju, and Angel Reese. You see most of those players have the ball in their hands a lot more than the rest of them. And it's a lot easier. It makes the women's side of college a lot easier to market, because there's a lot more matchups that you can pinpoint and matchups that you can sort of not only just exploit, but also bring awareness to, in the terms of media standpoint. Because the women's side, there's not really, you either stand out or you don't, I guess you could say. And then on the men's side, it's sort of not many people really stand out unless they have a great scoring performance. And you don't really hear a lot of men on the college side have these great scoring performances like they do. And I've had this question in the beginning, but it's I never really brought it to anyone's attention because I didn't really think it mattered. But is the style of play the reason why these women end up scoring? The rules of the game. I'm sorry, I meant to say the rules of the game. Is that the reason why these women are scoring more than the men? Because The women's side, you play 4 quarters. The men's side, you play 2 halves. So you could be a little bit more lax with your timeouts, and you also get a lot more breathing room if you're on the women's side, because you get time to sit out in between the first and the second quarter, whereas on the men's side, you have to play continuously, and the only time you stop playing is if there's a timeout on the court. So the substitutions, they also have to be a little bit different as well. And since the halves are 20 minutes long, that naturally means that there's less time in the game, because on the women's side, 12-minute quarters, you play 2 quarters and then the half. That means you're playing 24 minutes compared to on the men's side where you'd only have to play like 20 minutes or so. And that might cause, like, the fact that you can't really rest your players after quarters, it prevents them from being able to sort of perform as the game goes on, because you need that resting period. And it's like, you see this in the NBA and you see it in a lot of pro games where it's like, okay, they're going to sit their player from the end of the first quarter going into the second quarter, so that way they're completely rested, and because they're completely rested, they're able to perform a lot better on offense. You could see that on the women's side of college, but you don't see that on the men's side, because men's have to play in halves, and it's a completely different game that they have to learn. And there's also the fact that the women's side, they don't really have as many people on the same level as Caitlin or Juju, where on the men's side, everyone is relatively at the same level. You don't really see that many outstanding scoring performances in the NCAA tournament. You mainly see a much more dominant team effort than you do an individual score. Like, just look at the men's program over at UConn recently playing against, in their previous matchup, they ended up going on a 30-0 run. That's not something an individual player did. That was a team effort. And that team effort is constant. Like when they went up against Illinois, when they went up against all those other teams to make it this far in the tournament, that team play is constant. There's not always that one player that just outperforms the team and the complete other team. Like, I look at the box scores for UConn, it's relatively spread out in terms of scoring, apart from Donovan Clingan, who ended the game with 22 points and 10 rebounds. But the scoring was relatively split. Like, you have someone who had 11 points, you had someone with 5, someone with 10, someone with 2, someone with another 10, someone with 11, someone else with 2, someone else with 2. It's much more spread out as opposed to the women's side, where if you look at the box scores with Iowa going up against LSU, Caitlin Clark ended with 41 and Kate Martin ended the game with 21, and that was basically the only scoring that Iowa had, and that was the only scoring that they really needed, because LSU wasn't really scoring that much either. Angel Reese ended the game with 17 and 20, so not a bad performance for her. She did get fouled out later in the game, and a lot of Iowa fans waved goodbye as she got fouled out. But again, not much scoring on the women's side. Only 6 players on the women's side, they scored a bucket. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I counted that right. And one of them shot 2 for 10. So the fact that there were only 5 people, the fact that there were only 6 people who ended up scoring a bunch of points, and honestly, there were only 7 people in total playing in this game. So that doesn't help LSU whatsoever. The fact that they don't have that deep of a bench compared to the rest of the teams, and compared to the men's side as well. Usually on the men's side, they do complete substitutions, like complete lineup changes to go into either out of a timeout or into the second half. They do ridiculous lineup changes and everyone else gets a chance to play. But on the women's side, it's more like they don't have that deep of a bench, and it's more so dependent on how well your star player plays going up against another star player, similar to how it is in the NBA, where if you don't have that star player that can get you a bunch of points or can provide a lot for your team, you're not going to end up winning that game. And that's a bit of a reason why the women's side is a lot easier to market, because they're able to sort of pinpoint exactly which players are good and which players stand out, because they're easy to stand out. The skill gap is just so much wider between Caitlin Clark and the average women's college basketball player. And with that, we are out of time for this first segment, so tune in for the second segment as I talk about the Phoenix Suns, and particularly in Devin Booker, and their chances on the playoffs and how far they could go, how low they could go, and we'll see, just make some assumptions on like exactly what their trajectory looks like given this win. So I will be right back after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
And we are back with the second segment of the GSMC Basketball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. And in the second segment, we are going to be talking about the Phoenix Suns, particularly Devin Booker, and the great game that he had against the Pelicans. Before I begin, I'd like to remind everybody to please use the link in the description to get your comments recognized. The link is gsmcpodcast.net. It is displayed below the ticker as well as in the link in the description below every single show segment. Really helps the show, makes the show much more interactive between myself and you guys. Once again, it is gsmcpodcast.net. Really helps the show. And with that out of the way, we can go right ahead and talk about the Suns going up against the Pelicans and Devin Booker's elite performance. The Suns, they ended the game 124-111 against the Pelicans. Kevin Durant played 41 minutes but ended the game with 20 points and 7 rebounds. Devin Booker ended the game with 52 points and 9 assists. Jusuf Nurkic ended the game with 19 points and 19 rebounds. And that was basically it in terms of scoring for the team. Bradley Beal ended up getting 13 points on 5 of 8 from the field, so that was really efficient. It definitely helped, but far from the scoring performances that we're usually used to when seeing or when talking about Bradley Beal. Zion ended the game with 30 points and played 37 minutes. CJ McCollum ended the game with 15 points, and Trey Murphy III, ended the game with 21 points. And again, that was basically all the scoring coming in from the Pelicans. No Brandon Ingram because Brandon Ingram went out with an injury a few games ago. And with this 52-point game coming in from Devin Booker, he now joins Wilt Chamberlain as the only players to end up scoring 50 points against 3 straight times against a consecutive opponent. So 3 straight times in the season, and he scored 50 points against the Pelicans in all of them. And obviously, like, when you have someone who could score like this, it makes your job as a player a lot easier because all you have to do is just give him the ball and get out of the way, create space for him, and allow him to operate. And that's exactly what Phoenix did. And that's exactly what their offense is. Just force Kevin Durant and Devin Booker to run pick and rolls, and whichever shot they can get out of it is going to be the shot that you end up taking. Now, most of the time they end up taking the shot themselves, but they are Devin Booker has been a much better playmaker this year than he has in previous years. I wasn't really expecting him to play the point guard, but after losing Chris Paul, it sort of made sense that he would assume that role and play the point guard, and so far he's played it relatively well. Being a good scorer ultimately makes you a good playmaker because of all the attention that you draw from the defense, because like multiple teams are trying to sort of double team you and help whenever you drive to the paint, and that just creates a lot of open looks for the rest of the team. And when you're on a team that has Kevin Durant and Bradley Beal, they can't really leave those guys open, otherwise it's going to be an open three, and chances are they're going to end up making it. So that's sort of the offense that Phoenix is going to run throughout the entire playoffs. They've been running it throughout the regular season as much as they could. Some of the players have been getting injured. Kevin Durant has gotten injured. Devin Booker has also gotten injured. And Bradley Beal just recently got healthy and has been playing consistent games. So what are their playoff hopes looking like? So right now they're in the play-in. They're the 9th seed, I believe. Again, the seedings, they always flip-flop between the one and, well, not the one, between like the mid-tier teams, they always like flip-flop between spots. So right now, as I'm looking at the standings, they're 8th in the standings, and they're just 2 games in front of the Lakers. So there's a possibility that they might lose that play-in spot. And if they lose that play-in spot, that might cause a problem going into the playoffs and going later into the rounds, because they might play a matchup that they are not comfortable with, and that could either be the Nuggets, the Timberwolves, or the Oklahoma City Thunder. And with that in mind, there's a lot of different teams that you want to consider facing but probably don't want to face. And when you're Phoenix, I think the team that you want to go up against in the first round of the playoffs would be the Oklahoma City Thunder. Now, the reason why I say this is because OKC doesn't have a very, they do have a great rim protector with Chet, but in terms of the culture that they have, I don't really see them as like a team that could make it far compared to Phoenix, where I see them as a team that could easily make it as far as the Western Conference Finals before losing. So a little bit difficult sort of figuring out exactly what their ceiling is at the moment, because it's all dependent on who they play in the first round. If they play against Denver in the first round, that's a matchup that they do not want whatsoever, because there's not really a good enough center on the Phoenix Suns that is able to counter Jokic. And, they do have a good enough guard to counter Jamal Murray, but I'm not entirely sure if that's going to be enough for the rest of this team. And JP Bad in the comments, he said, tight race out in the West. Yes, it is a very tight race going into the West, and we have no idea exactly what team is going to end up taking the 1 seed, what team's going to end up taking the last seed. And if the lowest point they could go is falling out of the 8th seed and reaching it to the 9th seed and needing to play Golden State in the first round. And I think they're going to win in the first round of the play-in if they play against Golden State. And then they'd probably have to play against either, let's look at the teams in the standings right now. Again, they flip-flop. So they look to face either the Kings or the Lakers and the Warriors. So I think the Kings are definitely going to play the Suns in the play-in. That is just going to be a definite thing at this point. And so I feel like Phoenix has a matchup advantage when going against the Kings. Not to mention they also have much more experience than the Kings in the playoffs. So I feel like the experience and the matchups are just going to end up benefiting them more than it would benefit the Kings. And that would be their lowest point if they were to just fall all the way down to the 9th seed and have to play Golden State, and then immediately after that having to play the Kings. Because after they play the Kings, if they fall down all the way to the 9th seed, then they'd have to hold the 8th seed, which could be a variety of different teams. So again, it's all dependent on which team ends up taking that 1 seed and which team ends up taking the 2nd seed, because they're very, very close. And all 3 teams that are in the 1 through 3 seed in the West, they all have already clinched a playoff spot. So their chances are their starters are going to be much more rested than the Sun starters, which is another problem of the play-in that a lot of teams have addressed recently. It's the fact that they have to play these extra games when in reality it feels like they shouldn't. Because if you're in the 8th seed, it means that you're already like a playoff team. You shouldn't have to play games to like sort of determine where you stand, because you're already in the playoffs. And it's like, that's why a lot of people don't really like the play-in, because there's a few haters out there that think the play-in was just made for, like, you know, to give LeBron a chance to make the playoffs. And I see that logic, but at the same time I don't, because LeBron has to win every game like every other player has to win every game. But again, it does give a chance to the 10th and the 9th seed of making the playoffs, when in reality they probably shouldn't make the playoffs. And that's something that a lot of teams try to avoid now, because now it's like, okay, we're not safe with the 7th seed. We have to go all the way up to the 6th seed to avoid playing these extra games, because playing a lot more games, like, while we harp on these players for not playing enough games, the human body isn't really meant to handle that many games back to back to back. And obviously, if you were to rest before playing a long series against one specific team, you're going to have much more of an advantage, because not only would you be prepping for them while you rest, but you're also not going into every game, or like you're not going into game after game after game constantly playing at 100%. It's a lot of pressure for anyone to to be able to withstand and be able to hold up long term. So it makes sense how a lot of these teams, like, they don't really like the idea of a play-in, because it would mean they'd have to play a few more games. And when they already make the playoffs, it's like, why do they even need to play these games? Like, why would the Kings need to play games against the 10th seed when they've already made it into the playoffs and they already have a much better record than the rest of the teams below them? It's a little bit conflicting, but again, all of these new measures, they're put into the game so that way these players can play more games. Because if, let's say, like, it was a few years ago where there was no play-in and this team is in the playoffs right now as we're speaking, there's a chance that, like, they don't even need to play the rest of their starters out for the rest of the season, because they're already in the playoffs and they already have way more wins than the 9th seed. Now, this year, it's a little bit closer, so I can't really use this year as an example, but there have been previous years where it's like the team in the 9th seed or the 10th seed, they have way less wins. Maybe, like, we'll just give them 5 less wins than the team in the 8th seed and the 7th seed. And it would make sense that they wouldn't have a play-in back then, because it's like the gap between those teams is ridiculous. But now, now that that's a possibility, it forces a lot of these players to sort of play a lot more games than they would previously think of playing. Like 5 years ago, when the play-in wasn't a thing, players wouldn't even think of starting their players if they already have the 7th seed, and the 9th seed is like a 5-game difference. Because with how many games are left in the regular season, it doesn't really matter how many games you played. You're already, like, guaranteed a playoff spot. And it affects the clinches as well. Like, teams are clinching the playoffs a lot later than they normally would, and that's a result of the play-in tournament. So with Phoenix, again, like, it's all dependent on their matchup. So if they face the Thunder, I think they have the best chances of winning. If they face the Timberwolves, however, I'm not entirely sure what their chances would be. I do think they have much more of an advantage now, considering how Karl Anthony Towns isn't in the lineup and is injured. So I think they could deal with playing the Timberwolves. It would be a 6-game series at least, but they would be able to deal with the Timberwolves. It's the Denver Nuggets that's really, like, scaring a bunch of opponents, and I feel like that's the matchup that the Suns should worry about the most. But if they look to play the Thunder in the first round, I think they'll be fine. Again, the Thunder, they don't really have that playoff experience. So I think experience in the playoffs outlasts everything else. And with those players having playoff experience, with the Phoenix Suns having playoff experience, I think now is their time, I guess you could say. They do need Bradley Beal, however. Like, Bradley Beal's performances have been, like, up and down. They need him to be on his A game if they want to make it far. And so far, it doesn't really look like he's going to be nearly the same player that he was on Washington. But we'll see going into the playoffs, and we'll see how my prediction sort of lives up. But with that, we are out of time for this second segment. So now I'm going to go into the third segment where I give a quick recap of all the other NBA games that happened last night. So I will be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
And we are back with the third segment of the GSMC Basketball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. And in this third segment, we're going to be doing a quick recap of all the NBA games that went down last night. So we'll start with the Nets going up against the Pacers. Another loss for Brooklyn, obviously. I didn't expect to come out with this win whatsoever, so it makes sense how the Pacers ended up destroying the Brooklyn Nets 133-111, especially in their home court. Tyrese finally had a great game in the longest time, 27 points and 13 assists on 9 of 15 from the field. Let's see. Pascal Siakam ended the game with 15 points. Aaron Naismith ended the game with 11, and coming off of the bench, Jalen Smith ended the game with 17 points and 10 rebounds in just 16 minutes played. And Obi Toppin ended the game with 14 points. So obviously a lot of scoring coming in from the Pacers as usual. They're the best offensive team in the NBA right now. And it looks like they're going to be in the playoffs. And it looks like they're going to have the 6th seed secured. Again, that's what it looks like. The race is relatively close from the 6th seed and the 7th seed, the Pacers and the Heat. So we'll see how the standings change. But if worst comes to worst, I think their lowest point is having to play a play-in game and getting matched up against the Celtics in the first round, because that could be the death sentence for the Pacers. The Celtics, they have a great offense and they have a great defense. So the possibility of them playing them in the first round is not ideal and not something that they would want to look forward for, especially with Joel Embiid possibly being able to return to the Sixers. Now, I covered this in the previous segment about not the previous segment, but in the previous podcast, I covered that there's a possibility that Embiid could return from injury as soon as today, but it looks like right now he is still listed as not playing when we look at the injury reports for the Sixers. So maybe the return is not happening today, but it might happen really soon. So I'll just keep an update on that and what that could mean for the Sixers to finish out the season. But if they play the Sixers in the play-in, in the first round of the play-in, there's a possibility that they might lose that series. Well, they might lose that play-in series. because, how good Joel Embiid is and the fact that their defense is it's kind of mid, and their defense might allow a lot of points coming in from Joel Embiid, and that might not be something that the team is comfortable with. Now, if they do end up getting the 7th seed and they end up winning in the play-in, then there's a possibility that they go up against the Bucks, and I think that's a matchup that they would rather take than going up against the Boston Celtics. The Indiana Pacers, they've beaten the Bucks like 4 out of 5 times when they matched up against them in the regular season. So with that in mind, there is a big possibility that the Pacers could end up winning against the Bucks in that series, especially with Doc Rivers as the coach. I mean, I never put anything past that. So their low point would be playing in the play-in and making it in the 8th seed and losing in the first round to the Boston Celtics, and their highest point would be to making it all the way to the second round before they end up playing the Celtics. And by the looks of it, they're going to be playing the Cavs in the first round, and I think the Pacers are a much better team than the Cavs this year, even though, the Cavs, they have Donovan Mitchell, Darius Garland, but Garland has been struggling recently, and I just think the Pacers' offense is going to be a little bit too much for the Cavs if they end up going up against each other, but who knows, because Donovan Mitchell is one of the league's best playoff performers and one of the best playoff performers that we've ever seen, that I've ever seen as well. So there's a chance that he might just shut out my idea entirely and just beat the Pacers in the first round. But there's also a possibility that the Knicks could play the Pacers in the first round, and I think the Knicks are a much better team than the Pacers, and so there is a chance that they end up losing in the first round, but I don't think that's going to happen for this Pacers team. Again, it's all dependent on who they play. Now, if they play the Orlando Magic in the first round, then I think that the Pacers have the best chance of winning against the Orlando Magic, but we'll see. Again, it's dependent on how the standings are, and it's dependent on how far the team can go going into the final games. Now, the Brooklyn Nets, obviously, they haven't been eliminated yet, but I'm just waiting for that day to come. It's going to happen. The Nets are not a good team, and they sort of tacked it up for this season. They're in that weird spot where they win games, but they don't lose enough. So the draft pick that they're going to get is not going to be a high draft pick, and it's just this season just feels wasted when it should have been at least a play-in team, but no. The Celtics ended up playing the Charlotte Hornets. They ended up winning 118-104. And I don't really need to talk about this game much because you guys already know that the Celtics are the favorites to make it out. And the Hornets, they've already been eliminated, so there's not really much of a ceiling for the Hornets. They've already reached the bottom. And the Celtics, their ceiling, again, is the NBA Finals. And their lowest point is losing in the Eastern Conference Finals yet again. I don't know why this happens to Boston every single time, but it's very common for them to lose early in the playoffs. And there's nothing really much that needs to be said. Same with this game, the Grizzlies beating the Pistons. Again, two teams that aren't going to really do anything with the remainder of this season, so no need to really talk about it that much. Other than how the Memphis Grizzlies, they are the most injury-ridden team of this season. They've had the most starting lineup changes than any team this year, and obviously, injuries plaguing the Memphis Grizzlies. It's not something to be proud of, and it's not something to look forward to, especially for the next season, because if you're going to have a lineup that is this injury prone, it's what is the point if every other player is just going to be sitting out? But 31 different players have played for the Memphis Grizzlies this season. It's the most players to play on a team in a single season in NBA history. So again, with this in mind, it's a lot of injuries for one team, and it's a lot to handle. They need to get a lot more players that aren't riddled with injuries if they want to have a standing chance in this very competitive Western Conference for the future. Now, I talked about the Orlando Magic possibly playing against the Pacers. Now, that is going to be, again, their lowest point is a first-round exit, but their highest point is making it to the second round and doing nothing further from there, in my opinion. Now, they ended up beating the Trailblazers, but the score was really close. It was 104-103, and that's something that the Magic should be concerned about because the Portland Trailblazers, they're one of the worst teams in the Western Conference, especially defensively. They've allowed 60 points twice this season, and they're the only franchise to have multiple games where they were outscored by 60 plus or where they lost by 60 plus. And that's not something that being in a close game with these guys is not something to look forward to, especially if you're a playoff team and you're expected to do or to make a deep run. But again, the Orlando Magic end up winning this game, so don't really need to talk about that as much. And the Hawks ended up playing the Bulls. They ended up winning 113-101. Now, this is a potential play-in matchup in the first round against both of these teams. They hold the 9th seed and the 10th seed. Atlanta holds the 10th and Chicago holds the 9th. So there's a very big chance that both of these teams are going to end up playing against each other in the play-in. They're 5 games ahead of the Brooklyn Nets, who are the 11th seed, and they're 5 games behind the 8th seed and the 7th seed. So unless the rest of those teams lose out, it doesn't look like they're going to be moving up in the seedings. So it looks like that's going to be the matchup in the first round for both of them in the play-in, and they're going to have to win it in order to have a chance to. They're going to have to win out in order to have a chance to make the playoffs. And with DeJounte Murray, I'm not entirely sure if they're able to go all the way because he took 17 shots, ended the game with 17 points. Bogdanovic ended the game with 20 points on 6 of 7 from the field. And there was a lot of scoring for the Hawks, like all around, but there wasn't really that one player being like the star of the team, like how we're used to when Trae Young is in the lineup. So them not having Trae Young is also going to hurt their chances of winning in the play-in. And I don't think Trae Young is going to be returning this year. So that's going to bring up a little bit of a question going into free agency and going into the latter half of Trae Young's career on whether or not he's going to sign with the Hawks or if he's going to join a completely different team and try to make ends meet over there. On the Bulls side, DeRozan ended the game with 31 points. Kobe White ended the game with 22 points. And an overall very good scoring game coming in from the Chicago Bulls. They weren't efficient from 3, and they weren't as efficient as they hoped to be. 7 of 28 from 3, 25% from the three-point line. And again, the fact that this is a possible play-in matchup, they do not want to play like this when going up against them in the play-in, especially considering how they're pretty short-handed in terms of not having Trae Young. Now, with the Bulls, they're sort of, again, they're in that weird spot where they're winning games, but they're not losing enough, and they're not winning enough. So it's like they're in that mediocre tier where they have no idea where to go with this lineup, because this lineup, it's good enough to make it to the playoffs. And, like, on paper, it should be good enough, but when put into practice, it's just not. And they're going to have to make a decision on whether to ditch Zach LaVine completely or to ditch DeMar DeRozan completely. And that's obviously not a decision that you want to make if you're the Chicago Bulls, because both players are very good for your organization. And it's like, who do you go with at this point? It's like every single time it seems like they're going to get rid of Zach LaVine, but they end up don't, or they end up not getting rid of him. And they put themselves in this really weird spot where it's like, okay, what do we do now? Do we start winning or do we just start tanking? And it's not something that should be done long term if you're a franchise, because that's just going to spread a culture of not winning, and you need that winning culture when you're looking for a championship. And those are all the games that ended up happening yesterday. And with that, we are out of time for this third segment. So join me for the fourth segment as I look at the NBA Power Rankings that were just released yesterday. So I will be right back after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC. To access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
And we are back with the fourth segment of the GSMC Basketball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. And in this fourth segment, we're going to be looking at the power rankings going into this week. We do this every single week, so it's basically normal. Last week when we were doing the power rankings, I'll just go over the teams that were ranked last week and what I expect to be different going into these power rankings for this week. So the Nuggets and the Celtics, they were 1 and 2. I think that's going to stay the same. I think the Nuggets are going to stay at the 1 spot and the Boston Celtics are going to stay at the 2 spot. The Bucks were ranked 3rd, so I think that's going to drop. They're going to go all the way down to 4th. And with the Thunder clinching the playoffs, I think maybe the Thunder have a chance of moving back up into the top 3. And the Timberwolves were ranked 5th, so I think they're going to stay at the 5th spot. The Pelicans were ranked 6th. I think that's going to change. I think the Clippers are going to be ranked 6th, and the Pelicans are going to move down to let's say maybe the 10th spot at least, maybe even the 9th, but I think they're going to move down a lot. The Mavericks are going to move all the way up. Actually, no. The Clippers shouldn't be 6th. The Mavericks should be 6th going into these power rankings. And then underneath the Mavericks, so going to 7th, is going to be the Clippers. And then at 8 is the Phoenix Suns. I think the Phoenix Suns are going to stay at 8, like how they were in the last week. So we'll go ahead and check in on that. And then in the 9th spot, I said that the Pelicans were going to take that 9th spot. And the Knicks they were the 10th spot last week, so I think they're going to stay in that 10th spot. And they should be higher than the Cavs. They should, every single team in the Eastern Conference that's in the playoffs right now, from the Knicks and up, they should be higher than the Cavs, just because the Knicks, they've gotten better since they played the Cavs, and I just don't see the Cavs team just being better than the Knicks team. I just don't. Now, 11th was the Miami Heat. That was, if you paid attention on the previous time I did this, that was the only team that I had a problem with being ranked so high. I think they're going to move all the way down to maybe 15th or maybe even 17th at this rate. I do not think the Miami Heat are a team that should be that high in the power rankings, and I don't think they're a team that many people are scared of, despite the fact that they can make it to the playoffs and make it to the finals anytime. It seems like any time that they want. Even as an 8th seed, they made it to the finals. So, I'm still not afraid of them. The Cavs, they were ranked 12th in the power rankings last week. I think they're going to move up to 11th, so replacing the Miami Heat. Between the Cavs and the Kings, they're going to move either 11th or 12th. So I wouldn't be surprised if they flip-flop between both of those teams. Now, the Pacers were not in the top 15. I expect that to change in these power rankings. The Orlando Magic, they were the 14th team. I think they should be higher than the Miami Heat, but I don't think they're going to move from their standings. And the Lakers, they made a jump from 17 all the way up to 15. So I expect the hype around the Lakers to be at an all-time high, so the ratings are going to be, the rankings are going to be up for them. So we'll go ahead and see, and let me just go ahead and open up the power rankings right now. Here we are, and here's the articles, so we're going to look at them together. Luka's the thumbnail, so not surprised if the Mavericks, they end up moving up, like how I said. The Nuggets, they hold the 1 spot, as previously. Now, so should the Celtics. Yep, so the first 2 predictions, they were correct. And the third one is also correct. I predicted the Thunder were going to move up in the power rankings, and they did. The Timberwolves, they also moved up in the power rankings, so no surprises there. And yes, they replaced the Bucks that were, I thought the Bucks were going to be the 4th and the Timberwolves were going to be the 5th, but flip-flopping them, I guess it seems right considering how both of those teams clinched. So not really too far off on those predictions there. The Mavericks, I was right about the Mavericks moving all the way up to 6 and replacing the Pelicans, because the Mavericks, they've been winning these since All-Star break. They've been winning these teams. As you could see, they've won 11 of their last 12 games and 7 straight wins. That's the longest active winning streak in the league since beating the Houston Rockets, who had the 11-game winning streak. And with the winning in mind, that means that Luka Doncic has moved up in the MVP rankings. You saw that in the previous podcast where he moved up from being all the way down to the 4th spot all the way up to the 2nd spot. That is a huge jump in terms of MVP rankings. And it's almost like everyone knows that Luka's the best player in the league, but they can't give him the MVP because Dallas doesn't win as much. Now that they're winning, now it seems like the odds are more in Luka Doncic's favor. So the Pelicans, they ended up going in the 7th spot. So far, yeah, it's been more or less what I predicted. I didn't think they were going to take a huge drop, and they didn't. They only moved down 1. And I thought the Clippers were going to end up taking the 7th spot, but it looks like the Clippers ended up moving up 1, even though I thought that being in the 7th spot, like for the Clippers, it's a good enough ranking. But seeing as how the Pelicans, they've always beaten the Clippers every single time, I guess it makes sense ranking them higher than them, even though they don't have Brandon Ingram, which is why I thought that was going to be the difference maker. But looks like Phoenix, they ended up moving down in the rankings. They've stayed within that 8 or 9 spot. So again, their future and like their ceiling is a little bit uncertain. And the Knicks, they stay in the exact same spot like how I previously thought. So we'll go ahead and look at the rest of them. The Miami Heat didn't move once. Are you serious right now? You can't even see it. Here we go. The Miami Heat, they did not move a single ranking at all. They're the exact same ranking that they were last week, and I do not agree with that whatsoever. This team is incredibly overrated when it comes to playoff time because they just think the media just thinks that they can turn it on. And no, like that's not how it's going to work. Like they do not deserve to be ranked any higher anymore. Like since last week, their wins have been against the Trailblazers and the Wizards. Like obviously they're going to beat both of those teams. Both of those teams are bottom feeders in their respective conference. And I think the reason why they didn't really lose that much in the rankings is because they beat the Trailblazers by 60 points. Obviously, that's pretty impressive, but it's still the Trailblazers, and they lost to the Warriors, who are a play-in team in the Western Conference. They should have moved down, like at least one they should have moved down, because those wins, they just aren't impressive. Like, the Cavs, they should have flipped between the Cavs and the Heat, because like even though the Cavs, they lost to the Heat on Sunday, like the previous Sunday, it does not make sense to me. Like, not this Sunday, but like the last Sunday. And it still doesn't make sense how the Miami Heat are ranked so high, meaning that the Kings are ranked even lower. The rankings haven't changed from the bottom. Why? The Kings are arguably a better team than the Miami Heat are. They have a lot better matchups. They have a much better center. And, like, Sabonis, he's in the MVP conversation, and De'Aaron Fox is the second option, yet some people consider him the best option on the team. Why are they ranked lower than the Miami Heat? I don't get it. It's literally only because of Jimmy Butler and like the playoff prowess that he has. No, that's not right. The Pacers, they ended up moving up, so I guess the Lakers, they didn't change whatsoever. Yeah, that does not make any sense to me because the Lakers, they ended up beating the Pacers in their previous matchup, so it does not make sense to me how the Lakers are ranked lower than the Pacers, especially considering how many points they allowed the Lakers to score on them. I mean, 150 points scored on you, that is a lot of points. And now, Golden State, they make it all the way up to the 16 spot, so they jump from 19 all the way up to 16. For those of you listening to the audio side, you have no idea what I just did, but I basically just smacked my head in disbelief because the Orlando Magic are 17th. Somehow, they're ranked lower than the Golden State Warriors and the Lakers. Why? They're literally a 5th seed in the Eastern Conference. Why does not make any sense? Like these standings, like did they just give up towards the end of 12? Like I don't agree with that whatsoever. I think those standings are very bad. And I'm just going to look at the schedule real quick, and the Magic, they lost to the Clippers, so that's a better team than what the Miami Heat lost to on Friday. They played the Grizzlies, they beat the Grizzlies, and then they played the Trailblazers, and they beat the Blazers. They also lost to the Warriors, unfortunately, and they lost to the Kings. So that's probably why they ended up tanking so badly, because of those losses to competitive teams. But the Miami Heat didn't do much better against those competitive teams. I don't understand why they're ranked higher. But I digress. So let's see, keep going down, and we get to Houston, and here is the other play-in team that has a chance of making it to the playoffs. But again, I don't really see Houston making it all the way, so I think 18 is a respectable spot for them. We'll see if they can continue winning, but it doesn't really look like it. Now the Sixers, they're ranked 19th. They should have been ranked 19th a long time ago, considering how they were playing without Joel Embiid. But I feel like this ranking is fair for them. The Hawks are ranked 20th. Again, relatively fair. The Bulls, 21. After that win against the Hawks, it makes sense why the Hawks are... No, after that win that the Hawks had against the Chicago Bulls, it makes sense how they're ranked higher. And the rest of the teams are bottom feeders. So every other team that's under the Brooklyn Nets, bottom feeding team. Not really a team that's expected to do much, especially the Spurs. They were the first team ever to get eliminated from playoff contention. So... not sure why they're ranked so much higher, probably because of Victor Wembanyama and his performances. But again, bunch of bottom-feeding teams. Not the Portland Trailblazers being the worst team, worse than the Pistons, is actually very surprising. But losing by 60 points yet again is definitely not going to help you in the rankings. So again, all of these rankings, they sort of make sense, except for when you get into that mid area where you look at the Miami Heat and you're thinking, why are they even in the top 11? They should not be in the top 11. Like, if you ask me personally, I don't think these rankings are good enough. Like, I really don't think the Heat should be there. They just shouldn't. And they get way too much credit for being able to go far in the playoffs, because one of which could argue, like, well, you could make the argument that both of those playoff appearances are a little bit fluky. Like, you might not, like, saying that out loud, it's like, it's a little bit odd, because it's like, how could a team that made the finals in 2020 and then made it again a few years later, how could that be a fluke? And, like, with this Miami Heat team, it's like, I don't really know if you could call it a fluke, so might have to amend that statement right there saying that it was fluky. But a lot of these wins, it sort of seems like they shouldn't really happen, and that sort of culture of them winning games when they're underdogs have sort of overtaken the media, and it seems like they're giving credit a little bit earlier than they should. Like, I'm not going to deny that the Miami Heat have a huge possibility of being able to make it out of the first round, but they haven't even made it out of the first round yet. So the rankings shouldn't take that into account because it hasn't happened yet. And I feel like that's sort of what the media does as well, because it's like, whenever it comes close to playoff time, everyone thinks playoff Jimmy Butler. And I'm like, the playoffs haven't even started yet, and we're not even sure if the Miami Heat are going to be a legitimate threat like how they were in the previous season. Because, again, there's still the chance that they could lose in the first round or even get swept in the first round like how they've done in previous years. When they went up against the Bucks, they lost 4-0, and a lot of people thought that series was going to be a lot more competitive, but Jimmy Butler didn't show up. And Luna Emily in the chat. What's up, Luna? But yeah, so it's like this team is sort of like, it's a wild card team where it's like you have no idea what their ceiling is and you have no idea what their lowest point could be, because when they went in 2020, they made it all the way to the finals, and then in 2021 they ended up losing in the first round, and then 2022 they ended up losing in Game 7 to the Boston Celtics. But then they ended up beating the Boston Celtics right after that and advanced to the NBA Finals. Emily asked how I'm doing. I'm doing well. How about you? And it's like this thought process of like them being able to like win these games. It's sort of like, since they've done it 3 out of the last 4 years, it's somewhat expected of them to like, okay, they don't really try hard in the regular season. They turn it on in the playoffs. And I don't think that thought process is good enough for a team to be ranked as high as they are, because again, hasn't happened yet, so we might just be overhyping them. And usually, if we look at the common trend, when we overhype a team, they end up doing a lot worse than what everyone expects. So it might be the pressure that might get to them. And Luna Emily asks, how long have I been streaming? Well, I've been doing this stream for about an hour, but as a whole, in terms of streaming, I think it's been, I'd say about like 4 months maybe, around that time, 4-5 months, something around that. But yeah, that's how long I've been streaming for, and that's how long I've been doing this podcast. And regardless, like the Miami Heat, they've it seems like I always want to get back to the topic of discussion whenever a comment comes up. But again, it's like they get overhyped, and I don't agree with them getting overhyped because these tournaments, these matchups, they haven't happened yet, and we don't even know who they're going to be playing in the first round. So the hype might end up being for nothing, because if they lose in the first series of the play-in and they end up playing the Boston Celtics, I don't think they're going to make it against the Celtics. Emily says, can I ask something? I mean, yeah, you can go ahead and ask. I'll see if I can answer. But the Celtics team that is not the same team that they ended up playing the previous few years, and they almost lost in 7 games going up against that Boston Celtics team. So it's like a lot of these teams, they've definitely improved, and the Miami Heat, they aren't one of those teams that I feel made that big jump of improvement, like how the Boston Celtics made a jump in improvement. And that's sort of like teams that haven't gotten better in the offseason. I don't really understand how they expect to match up against other teams who have gotten better, because it's not the same team that they went up against. Like, a lot of people are not ambitious, but like they're optimistic that the Cavs have what it takes to beat the New York Knicks. But the Cavs team hasn't changed from the last year, and they ended up losing 4-1. This Knicks team ended up getting better since the last year. So what's the logic in thinking that the Knicks team can't do it again? Because they already done it previously, and they've gotten better since then. But that's sort of like the question. That's sort of the thought process and things of that nature. So Emily says that she does custom artwork for the streamers to enhance their streaming experience. I mean, that's not really a question. That's more of like a statement. So, like, I don't really know how I can help you with that. And she asked, would I like anything to be made for my channel? I think I'm relatively good. If I do, then I'll let you know. But I think right now I'm good where I'm at, just because, like, I mean, I think the system that I have right now is fine the way it is, because it's really just like me talking about basketball. There doesn't really need to be any sort of flashy artwork going around. But again, I have no idea. We'll see. And it's not just me that makes these decisions on what we do. It's like a whole team decision on what gets done, and I don't really have a say in that. So can't really say much about that. My bad if you were looking for an opportunity, but you're gonna have to find it elsewhere. Unless one of the higher-ups sees you in the comments and is like, let's see what this person's talking about. But not entirely sure. Can't really help you on that. But with that, we are out of time for this final segment, and that is the end of the podcast. So thank you so much for tuning into GSMC Basketball Podcast, presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show and leave a positive review. It really does make a difference. We also invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram for more content and updates. As always, please use the link in the description to get your comments recognized, or the link displayed below the ticker on every single show segment. It is GSMCPodcast.net. Really helps the show, makes the show much more interactive between myself and you guys. Thank you once again. This is the end of the show. I am your host, Nelson, and as always, take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't